chance to play with some incredible people in the Android Netrunner, rest in peace, and Magic the Gathering communities. But it's time to clean off the rose-tinted glasses and use what I've learned from the other games to dive into competitive YuGiOh. Welcome to episode 8 of Diving into YuGiOh, and in this episode we're trying out a super budget trap shaddoll list, so let's get straight into it. Okay, diving straight into the deck list. This is a really budget deck that's basically just 3 of the structure decks plus a bunch of trap cards. So going through it, we've got 3 of each of the core shadolls, so that's 3 Wendy, 3 Squamata. These just let you get access to all the other shadolls as and when you need them. 2 Aerial, there's a load of graveyard-based decks in our meta, so this is a choice against that. 1 Hedgehog, which is another Searcher, adds to hand. Beast, some draw power. Dragon, spell and trap card removal or a bounce. And then Falco, which is a body that brings itself back once a turn. Then moving on to the slightly more expensive cards in Ash Blossom, you can replace this with any other hand trap you want. Effect Veiler works well because it's a light. Ghost Ogre can work fine too. I think Ash is going to be the best in our metagame, so I went for that. Similar reason I went for Gammas. These are lights, which works really well with El Shaddoll Construct, and there's a lot of decks, like I said, Tri Brigade and Phantom Knights don't really want negates and destroys against them, and then you obviously have to run the one driver to go with it. I wonder how many times I'm going to draw that this week. For our spells, we have 3 El Shaddoll Fusion. This is a control version, so we want to be fusion summoning in our opponent's turn more than our own turn. That said, we've got the 1 Shaddolls Fusion we can search out if we need to summon from using materials from our deck. 3 Super Poly outs a lot of things. This deck is really good at dealing with darks, lights, and most of the big monsters you really care about are darks and lights. And ultimately, Barrier Statue you can just deal with another trap, so you don't need to run Wendigo or anything in the extra deck. Going into our traps, we're running 3 Paleozoic Deinamiscus, which I'm not even sure is entirely mandatory. So if you don't want to fork out for these, you can play an even cheaper trap if you want. 3 Dogmatica Punishment, dump an Entis, dump an App Cologne, and get a 2-for-1. Excellent card. 3 Torrential Tribute, massive blowout card, basically in every control deck that could run it. 3 Sinister Shadow Games gives us access to our Shaddolls. 2 Shadow Incarnation gives us some recursion and some board manipulation. And 1 Shaddoll Core if we either need it to be a piece of material or a piece of recursion. So that's our main deck, and as you saw, super budget. This deck isn't even running Schism, which is definitely an incorrect choice when it comes to competitiveness, but in terms of budget, we're testing if the deck can run without it this week. Going into our extra deck, there's a bunch of cards in here that are just here to be tested out. I don't think they're all going to work, and if I had better options, they'd probably be replaced almost immediately, but in the name of keeping it budget, I'm trying out some cards that are very, very affordable. So, 3 El Shaddoll Construct, Impure Shadolls or Trap Shadolls, this is pretty much always at 3. 2 Winder, which is one hell of a floodgate. This even puts Darklaw to shame. Only 1 special summon a turn is just backbreaking for a load of decks. 2 App Cologne and an Entis. These cards allow us to use Dogmatica Punishment as a 2-for-1 instead of just a 1-for-1. Sending App Cologne lets us get access to our Shaddolls. Entis lets us pop us another card. Mud Dragon and Starving Venom Fusion Dragon as Super Poly targets. I don't think the deck needs additional Super Poly targets, but I'm putting them in there because I've got the room, and if they come up, then that might change my opinion. We have a Shaddoll Construct because we don't have Artemis, and with only Gammas and Driver as our lights, we need a way to get into Construct that isn't just using Shaddoll Fusion from deck. Then we have Nightmare Phoenix and Nightmare Unicorn as generic extra deck removal. And then, finally, our Link 4s are Borreload Dragon and Mekk-Knight Crusadia Avramax. Bluntly, these are because I don't have Borrelsword Dragon, and I'm still not quite figured out how I get this out, so I don't think this guy's going to be here very long, but I want to see if I can make it work. Okay, going into our extra deck, we have free Nibiru. This is for combo decks, and if you don't face many combo decks, saves yourself some money and don't put Nibirus in. Free Drawn Lockbird. Deals with stuff like Dragon Link quite neatly. Free Cosmic Cyclone for back row decks. Free Solemn Judgment when we need to negate more than we need to destroy. And a going second package comprising of 2 extra Shaddoll fusions and a Dino Wrestler Pankratops. So ideally we want to go first because our deck is full of trap cards, but when we know we're going to be made to go second, bringing in these big go second plays is going to be very key to our success. And that's our deck for tonight. Ultimately, the goal of locals this week isn't to win, even though it'd be cool to win with such a budget list. It's to figure out if we enjoy playing Shaddolls and if it's worth making the investment for the slightly more expensive cards like Schism, or if the deck's just fine without them. So, without further ado, let's go straight to locals. We have a 4-round locals this week. The leagues have become a monthly fixture, so we have a 5-week league, but that's not going to be the focus this month as we're currently learning a new deck. For the first round, we're up against Phantom Knight Fire, which is a combo between Phantom Knights and Burning Abyss. Our opponent starts off with a tour guide that we hit with an Ash. They play through this Ash and get to Rusty Bardiche, Dark Rebellion, and Levier. We open our turn with Super Poly, fusing the Rebellion and Bardiche into Starving Venom. Normal summon Squamata and go to battle phase, forcing our opponent to Fogblade their own monster so we can't attack. We pass with a face down El Shaddoll fusion. We use that fusion to go into Winder in response to Torn Scale's effect, with Squamata sending Wendy to summon another Squamata from our deck. This causes our opponent to pass with another face down Fogblade. On our turn, we flip the Squamata, popping the Levier and go to battle phase, forcing the Fogblade to be used on Torn Scales. In our end step, our opponent uses Fogblade in the graveyard to revive Breaksword. On their turn, they attempt to rank up the Breaksword. Not wanting Winder to get her attack halved by Rebellion and run over by a normal summon, I use Dino-Miscus to banish Breaksword and discard the last card in my hand. This ends up not working in my favour as their normal summon is just a Torn Scales with only 600 attack. They still have their special summon this turn, allowing them to bring out Jar Jar, who banishes Winder with its effect. I definitely jumped the gun with Dino-Miscus here. From here, they just use their graveyard to build up to a board we can't contest with a lone El Shaddoll fusion. Game 2, we go first and open with a T-set, planning to El Shaddoll fusion a Winder in response to their first special summon. However, I wasn't expecting that summon to be a Pankratops, which can easily blow away Winder. I was hoping they'd end up using Pankratops as material for something so that I could bring out Winder safely, but it wasn't to be, and our opponent got to basically go full combo. Hindsight shows me I probably should have just forced the Pankratops to deal with Winder, but that was kind of learnt by fire here. Their end board ends up being Levier, Dark Requiem, Pankratops, Rusty Bardiche, and Cherubini. We go back and forth a few turns, but our resources just get eaten up and we bleed out. These games really highlighted the lack of Schism in the deck. Our opponent just used the graveyard once we had both emptied our hands, and I was unable to. This basically made any value gained by early trades kinda meaningless. Combine this with a poor Dino-Miscus in Game 1, and failing to figure out an answer to Pankratops in time in Game 2, and we get cleanly 2-0'd. Round 2, we're up against Zodiac Tri-Brigade. And Game 1, we're going first. We set a monster, and 2 back row, and pass to our opponent, who does the usual Zodiac Borbo trick to get into Zeus. I attempted to Dino-Miscus the Borbo, not realizing Ram gave it a protection ability. To be honest, I'm struggling to remember all the things my own cards do, so I'll let this one slide. We Super Poly the Zeus away into Construct using our Falco, sending Wendy with Construct to summon Squamata from deck. Now I know that Tri-Brigades can use the Zodiac monsters from their graveyard link summons. The correct choice here was almost certainly to send Ariel and get the Zodiacs out of the graveyard. On our next turn, our opponent hits us with Torrential Tribute when we flip Squamata, so all we're left with is a Falco that's revived itself. We set another monster and a back row before passing turn. Our opponent goes into Shureg using Tri-Brigade Revolt in our end step and banishes our Res Shaddol Incarnation. On their turn, I learned just how busted Access Code Toolkit is as it wipes the floor with us. Game 2, we go first and pass with 3 back row. using Torrential on Zeus's summon. Probably a good idea in the future to use Torrential on something before Zeus in this deck, as this ends up allowing Zeus to wipe away all of our back row with its effect. This forces us to Sinister Shadow Games a Wendy to summon Squamata once Zeus is gone. Our opponent passes with 3 back row of their own. On our turn, we Shaddoll Fusion for an El Shaddoll construct which eats an impermanence. We swing for 2800 and our opponent cyclones our follow-up face down, leaving them at 5200. On their turn, they use the Tri-Brigade effect to link summon Shureg using material from grave again, banishing our construct. Our last face down is a Super Poly, which we have no cards in hand to discard for, so we get beat up over the next couple of turns. Another match where our opponent is able to make much better use of their graveyard than we can, combined with a few poor decisions, made these games feel super one-sided. We got the bye in round 3, so we spectated a game between Zodiac Tri-Brigade and Lyrillist Tri-Brigade to try and really understand what makes Tri-Brigades tick. Round 4 we faced off against Dragonlink, and honestly game 1 wasn't too much to talk about. We drew Driver but had a fusion spell to use it to go into Construct, and unfortunately our opponent hit the fusion spell with Legionnaire and shuffled it back into the deck. This left us to just T-set and pass, which basically got rewarded with an OTK by the Bottle Brothers. Game 2, on the other hand, was much more interesting. We went first and opened with a set 2 and pass. Our opponent goes into Chaos Ruler, triggering it and Absoralta Dragon's effects. We Gamma the Absoralta to prevent it adding Tracer, causing our opponent to add Tracer off of the mill from Chaos Ruler. They then use Quick Launch for another Tracer, at which point we use Dogmatica Punishment, sending Entis to knock out both of their dragons. Continuing on, they bring out Legionnaire to destroy 2 cards on the field. We chain Sinister Shadow Games to send Wendy, meaning our Gamma and Driver get destroyed, but then Wendy's effect would let us summon another Shaddolls, if it didn't get ashed. Our opponent ends their turn on Seal, Tracer, and Boot Sector Launch. We simply T-set and pass right back. On their next summon of Legionnaire, we chain Torrential Tribute to its Destroy effect, wiping the board and letting our Wendy bring out a Squamata. We get in for some damage with the Squamata and set another monster, passing back. Our opponent goes into Chaos Ruler using its effect and attacks into our face down Hedgehog, which adds Shaddoll Fusion to hand. On our turn, we use the Shaddoll Fusion to go into Winder after remembering that Chaos Ruler no longer remembers being summoned from the extra deck. This banishes the Legionnaire, Tracer, and Recharger from our opponent's graveyard with the Aerial, and sends Wendy with Squamata to special summon Beast face down. Winder ends up getting destroyed by Chaos Ruler on our opponent's turn and adds Shaddoll Fusion back to our hand. On our turn, we flip Beast to draw a card and set a face down. Our opponent uses Black Metal Dragon to go into a Striker Dragon and bring out Red MD. In combat, our Beast is destroyed by Chaos Ruler and Squamata is flipped, targeting Chaos Ruler, leaving our opponent to go into Spheres for the end of their turn. Now we can use our main deck for Shaddoll Fusion. We bring out Construct by sending Gamma and Aerial. Aerial banishes the remaining Dark Dragons from our opponent's graveyard, and Construct sends Falco to our graveyard, special summoning itself. Our opponent then attempts to use Spheres on Construct, but we banish Shaddoll Incarnation and another Shaddolls to flip the Construct face down, so there are no valid targets for Spheres. At this point, our opponent scoops as they've run out of resources. Game 3, we draw a bunch of our hand traps, and between Gamma and Droll, we stop their first turn. However, all we can follow up with is a single set monster. On the next turn, we use Nibiru as our opponent is about to go into Savage Dragon. However, they're able to get to Red MD, who revives a Boral Sword from earlier in the turn. Boral Sword ends up eating Nibiru, dropping us to 5k, and Red MD eats our face down Wendy, who summons a Squamata from deck with her flip effect. On the following turn, Squamata flips to pop the Red MD and time gets called before we can do anything about the Boral Sword. We're down in life points, so the round goes to our opponent. This is a very fun matchup. I feel like this deck has a much better matchup against Dragonlink than Heroes does, and with a bit more practice, and speeding up the turns a little, it's not unrealistic to see this deck taking a match off of them. In conclusion, this wasn't too bad a showing for the first time playing the deck. Ultimately, it took a while to get the feel of the deck, but once we did, we were able to keep up with one of the best decks in the format. There's definitely some holes in the build that need shoring up, but it was great fun to play and seems like a much better fit in the format than Heroes. So we're going to keep playing it for a while. Going over our games this week, I noticed two main issues with the deck that I'm hoping to resolve with these 3 cards. The first problem is that we don't really have a way to OTK our opponent. When there's an opening, or we've just had a load of favourable trades, or run our opponent out of resources, all we can kind of do is just chip in for a little bit of damage with Shaddolls and hope they don't draw anything. In order to fix that, we're adding Borrelsword Dragon to the party. This guy is a ton of damage and can just win games in one turn. And that's something the deck is currently really lacking, so great card to add. Is it as good as Access Code? No, but it's way cheaper. And another problem is that we didn't really have a way to get to Link 4, so even with Borrelsword in the deck, we need to add Cross Sheep. This card turns our problem of not really being able to amass the resources to make a Link 4 into being able to make Link 4s off of a single card, such as Shaddoll Fusion. This is an incredible card, and I was initially confused why a card that was initially a rare and just had a reprint and it only came out a year ago was so expensive. But I understand now after actually learning how to use it. This card is incredible. And then finally, the other big problem with our deck was that after doing all the early game trading and filling up the graveyards, decks like Tri-Brigade and decks like Phantom Knights would just start using their graveyard to outvalue us anyway. So it didn't matter how favourable our early game trades are, because the game would always go long, we would just get ground out by their graveyards. And sure, we have Aerial to remove some of their graveyards, but Phantom Knights can put like 20 plus cards in the graveyard that are all able to do stuff in the graveyard. Aerial can't deal with that on its own. So we need to match them. And in order to do that, we're adding Shaddolls Schism to the deck. This is a card that I was originally going to apply the same philosophy as Bane and Gold for. I wasn't going to buy it because it's expensive, and there is a reprint possibly coming up in the Megatins this year. However, I got this at a great deal of a price, so even if it does get reprinted, the price probably won't be much lower than what I ended up paying for it, and if it wasn't for that deal price, I would have abstained from buying it. So I got very lucky with picking up a Schism on the cheap, and that means we can bring our deck up to much higher power level. Schism gives us access to actually use our graveyard effectively. Cross Sheep and Borrelsword allow us to actually OTK our opponents. These 3 cards change the power level of our deck so much that I think it's going to be a completely different story next week. Based on our pickups this week, our deck changes are going to be as follows. Add 1 Schism to the main deck. I'm not going to take out anything yet because I'm not really sure what should be taken out. It means running at 42, but there's so much searchability in the deck that I don't really think that's going to be too much of a problem. And then for extra deck, we're adding Psyframe Lord Omega, so we can actually make use of Gamma and Driver if we use Gamma on our turn. Cross Sheep and Borrelsword for our OTK plan. And to make space for those, we're taking out Mud Dragon or Swamp, Borrelord Dragon, and Mech Knight Crusadia Avramax. This deck really doesn't seem like it's going to be making Link 4s very often, so taking these out to replace with just the Borrelsword seems perfectly fine. And as I alluded to at the start of the video, Mud Dragon just doesn't have many applications when you can already deal with light targets. And then I have ordered a Gravity controller as well. I had to actually order a playset because it was cheaper to order a whole playset than one individual card for some reason. And if that comes before next locals, then I'm going to take out Nightmare Phoenix in place of it. Nightmare Phoenix is great, but I did have to make a cut to make room for Gravity Controller, and it's ultimately the one I came down to. Okay, so Gravity Controller did end up coming, and that's going in the extra deck over Nightmare Phoenix. So that's ultimately going to wrap us up for this week. We've had our first locals playing Shaddolls, and I think it went pretty well all things considered. The deck is incredibly budget, incredibly fun, and if anyone has the Shaddoll decks just lying around, I really suggest giving it a try because it is an absolute blast. Even without Schism, even without the big extra deck monsters, you can still have a load of fun with the deck, and yeah, it's just a great time. Is it going to win you at locals? Maybe not if you're not Pack, but then again, Pack can win with basically anything. So, thank you very much for watching this episode of Diving into YuGiOh, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one, where we take a much more powerful deck to locals and see how we do.